The night sky over the Nevada desert was clear and quiet, as it often was. The stars twinkled above like distant fireflies, and a soft breeze whispered through the barren landscape. Jackson Quinn, a rugged outdoorsman with a weather-beaten face and sharp eyes, sat by his campfire, gazing out into the vast emptiness of the desert. He'd lived out here for years, far from the noise of civilization, finding peace in the solitude. The distant mountains, the endless horizon, this was home. Then, without warning, the sky split open. It began as a shimmer, like heat waves rising from the sand, but far too high in the atmosphere. Quinn frowned, narrowing his eyes at the strange sight. The shimmer grew larger, pulsating with a violet glow that intensified with each passing second. He stood up from his campfire, squinting as the glow became blinding, and the desert fell eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then came the sound, a low hum, deep and vibrating, like the song of some colossal creature waking from a long slumber. The sky tore apart, revealing a gaping rift, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. Out of the breach descended a ship unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Its surface was smooth, organic, and alive with shifting colors, blues, purples, and greens that danced like liquid light. It was massive, easily the size of a small city, and its descent was so graceful, so silent, that it seemed like a hallucination. But it was real. Very real. Quinn watched in stunned silence as the vessel hovered above the desert, its underside glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Smaller ships, sleek and insect-like, detached from the larger craft and darted out in different directions, heading toward the major cities of Earth. The main ship, however, remained fixed above the desert, as if it had found something of interest. The world, it seemed, had just changed. Within hours, the world's media was abuzz with the news: alien contact. Governments scrambled to respond, military forces mobilized, and scientists were deployed to study the alien ships. But it wasn't an invasion. There were no attacks, no threats, no signs of hostility. Instead, a broadcast signal was sent out to every television, radio, and digital device on the planet. A woman appeared on the screens, if she could be called a woman. She stood tall, over 7 feet, with flawless, opalescent skin that shimmered with a pearl-like sheen. Her hair cascaded in long waves of iridescent color, constantly shifting like oil on water. Her eyes were a deep, mesmerizing violet, and her features were impossibly perfect, symmetrical to the point of being otherworldly. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if beauty itself had been engineered to its highest form. She spoke, and her voice was like music, melodic, soft, and hypnotic. "People of Earth," she began, her words echoing across every device on the planet, "we are the Zalari. We come in peace." The message continued, explaining that the Zalari were a highly advanced species from a distant galaxy. They had traveled across the stars not to conquer or destroy, but to observe and uplift. They claimed to have come to offer humanity the chance to join a greater galactic community, to share in their knowledge and technology. But beneath the surface of their diplomatic words, there was an undercurrent of condescension. "Your species is young," the Zalari ambassador, named Solara, said. "Your civilizations are still primitive, your minds limited by your environment. But we see potential in you, and we wish to help you evolve." It didn't take long for people to start noticing the Zalari's subtle disdain. They looked upon humans with an almost clinical detachment, as if observing a species of animal barely crawling out of the mud. Their beauty, their perfection, was so overwhelming that it created a divine and unspoken declaration that they were superior, and humans were lesser. As the days passed, the Zalari established bases in various locations across the globe. One such base was built in the Nevada desert, not far from where Jackson Quinn lived. The base itself was a marvel of alien technology, organic-looking structures that rose from the sand like growing coral, pulsating with soft light. Scientists and government officials flocked to the site, eager to communicate with the alien visitors and understand their technology. But not everyone was so enthralled. Quinn watched from the periphery, keeping to himself as always. He had no interest in getting involved with what he saw as just another overhyped government circus. He could hear the distant hum of the Zolari ships as they hovered above the desert, casting a soft glow on the horizon. People in the nearby towns spoke in awe of the aliens, of their beauty, their advanced knowledge, and their promises to guide humanity into a new age. But there was something about the Zolari that made Quinn uneasy. It wasn't just their flawless appearance or their too perfect voices. It was the way they looked at people, like they were examining a bug under a magnifying glass. Cold. Detached. Beautiful, yes, but without a hint of warmth or empathy. It wasn't long before the Zolari began selecting humans to study. They would summon influential leaders, scientists, and thinkers to their base, putting them through a series of tests. Those who impressed the Zolari were given access to advanced knowledge, while those who failed were politely dismissed, though not without a thinly veiled sense of disappointment from their alien hosts. The media began to whisper about the Zolari's true intentions. Were they really here to help humanity evolve? Or were they merely sizing up the species, deciding whether Earth was worth their time? The sense of inferiority grew stronger as more people interacted with the Zolari, who were always polite, always gracious, but always distant, like gods observing mortals. And then came the fateful night when Jackson Quinn, tired of the constant hum of alien ships and the buzzing chatter of the media, decided to go on a late-night walk. He wasn't expecting much, just a break from the noise. But as he walked further into the desert, the distant glow of the Zolari base caught his eye. He didn't know it yet, but that night would change everything. In the distance, something shimmered under the moonlight. Jackson Quinn had never been one for grand spectacles or the allure of power. While the rest of the world scrambled to make sense of the Zolari's arrival, he remained rooted in his own world, far removed from the frenzied excitement. Quinn's life was simple. He lived off the land, traded with locals when needed, and spent most of his time working with his hands. He had built his cabin from scratch, crafted his tools, and prided himself on the kind of independence most people had forgotten about. The Nevada desert had been his sanctuary for years. The sun-scorched landscape, with its rugged mountains and endless stretches of dry sand, offered a peace he couldn't find anywhere else. It was here, amidst the silence of the desert, that Quinn had learned to trust his instincts, relying on nothing but the raw knowledge of survival. There was a purity to it, a way of life where nature ruled supreme and every decision mattered. But now, the peace was gone. The constant hum of Zolari ships had become a near-permanent presence over the desert, their sleek, organic forms casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Their glowing bases, scattered across the earth, were beacons of alien influence. Quinn had avoided them as best he could, staying away from the areas where government agents and scientists flocked, but there was no escaping the truth. The world had changed, and the Zolari were at the center of it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert was bathed in hues of orange and purple, Quinn noticed something unusual on the edge of his land. In the distance, a soft violet glow flickered between the dunes, too steady and deliberate to be a natural phenomenon. He squinted, frowning. It wasn't one of the Zolari's large ships, but smaller, like a transport vessel. The sight stirred a mix of curiosity and irritation. The last thing he wanted was alien visitors poking around his territory. But the glow remained, steady and unnatural against the otherwise serene landscape, and something in his gut told him to investigate. Grabbing his well-worn jacket, a flashlight, and his trusty campfire knife just in case, Quinn set off into the desert. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he made his way toward the light, the cool desert air biting against his skin. The glow grew brighter as he approached, casting long shadows over the dunes. As Quinn crested a hill, he froze. There, not 50 yards away, stood a Zolari transport vessel, its smooth, organic surface glowing faintly in the twilight. The ship was smaller than the others he had seen, sleeker, almost insect-like in design, as if it had been grown rather than built. Standing beside the ship were 5 Zolari, their tall, graceful figures silhouetted against the light. At the center of the group stood Ambassador Solara. Quinn had seen her before on the broadcasts. She was the face of the Zalari, the one who had delivered their message to humanity. In person, she was even more striking, impossibly tall, with skin that shimmered like polished marble and eyes the color of amethysts. Her hair, flowing and iridescent, seemed to ripple in the soft breeze, catching the light in mesmerizing waves. But it wasn't her beauty that caught Quinn's attention. It was the way she carried herself, regal, confident, as if she belonged above the ground she walked on. She was speaking to her aides in a language Quinn didn't understand, her voice soft but commanding. As he watched, one of the Zalari turned, spotting him in the distance. The alien's violet eyes widened slightly in surprise, and it spoke in rapid Zalari to Solara. The ambassador paused, turning to face Quinn, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made the air around him feel heavier. "You there, human," Solara's voice rang out, effortlessly smooth, yet with an edge of authority. "What are you doing here?" Quinn stayed where he was, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "This is my land," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "I go where I please." Solara raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at the edges of her flawless lips. Her aides, however, looked offended by his casual tone, their perfect faces darkening with disapproval. They were not used to being addressed so directly by humans, who usually trembled in awe or fear in their presence. "You are trespassing on a zone of Zalari operations," one of the aides said coldly, stepping forward. "This area is now under our jurisdiction. You will leave." Quinn crossed his arms, standing his ground. "Like I said, this is my land. You don't just roll in here and start making the rules." The air between them grew tense. Solara's eyes glittered with a mix of amusement and curiosity. This human wasn't like the others. He didn't fawn over their beauty or power, nor did he seem afraid of them. There was a rawness to him, a kind of primal confidence that Solara hadn't encountered before in any of the human diplomats, scientists, or world leaders. She stepped closer to him, her movements slow and deliberate. Even as she approached, her towering form didn't seem to intimidate him. If anything, Quinn's expression remained unbothered, as if he had seen far stranger things in his life. "You sing. Different from the others of your kind," Solara said, her voice softer now, less commanding. She looked him over as though trying to understand what made him so indifferent to her presence. "Most humans are in awe of us. Why aren't you?" Quinn tilted his head, studying her in return. "I've seen enough in my life not to be impressed by someone just because they look pretty or have fancy toys," he replied. "You might be advanced, but out here in the desert, none of that matters." Solara's smile widened slightly, though her eyes still glimmered with that cold, calculating edge. "And what does matter to you, then?" Quinn's gaze didn't waver. "Survival. Freedom. The land beneath my feet. Things you don't need spaceships to understand." The Zalari aides exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with his defiance. One of them took a step forward, as if preparing to issue another demand, but Solara held up a hand, stopping him. She continued to regard Quinn with that same unreadable expression, as if weighing him in her mind. "Interesting," she murmured. "You think yourself superior in some way, don't you?" Quinn shook his head. "I don't think I'm superior. I just know who I am. Seems like you folks have a lot, but you don't know much about living on the ground." For a moment, Solara was silent, her gaze never leaving Quinn's. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't respect, not yet, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps a recognition that this human, unlike the others she had met, was not cowed by their presence. "You're an anomaly," she said at last, her voice tinged with amusement. "I'd like to understand you better." Quinn raised an eyebrow, not sure if he liked the sound of that. "I'm not one for being studied." Solara's smile was still there, but it was more genuine now, as if she found his resistance amusing rather than irritating. "You'll be surprised what you can learn from those who don't follow the same path as you." He said nothing, simply watching her with that same calm, unreadable expression. After a long moment, Solara gestured to her aides, who stepped back into the ship, the soft hum of its engine starting up again. "Keep your land, human," she said, her tone suddenly lighter. "But we'll meet again. I'm curious to see if you can teach us something new." And with that, the transport vessel lifted gracefully into the air, the violet glow fading as it disappeared into the night sky. Quinn stood there for a long while, watching the stars, wondering if his life in the desert was about to get far more complicated. The world had already changed, but Jackson Quinn was about to find out just how deeply that change would cut into the core of who he was. Word of Jackson Quinn's encounter with Ambassador Solara spread quickly, first among the Zalari and then through the human media channels. A desert recluse, a man without political or academic status, had somehow caught the attention of the most influential Zalari leader on Earth. To the Zalari, it was an anomaly, something to be studied, catalogued, and explained. To the humans, it was a curiosity how had this man, living in the remote desert, managed to captivate the beings that considered themselves so far beyond human understanding. The next morning, a sleek Zalari transport hovered silently above Quinn's cabin, casting long shadows over the desert sand. He had been sitting on his porch, sipping coffee, when the ship arrived. It descended slowly, its iridescent surface shifting colors like the skin of a living creature. This time, Quinn didn't need to go to them. They had come to him. A soft hum vibrated the air as the ramp extended from the ship, and out stepped two Zalari aides, tall, graceful, and, as always, impossibly beautiful. But this time, Solara herself wasn't among them. Instead, one of the aides, a Zalari male with hair that shimmered like silver, stepped forward, his expression perfectly composed. "Jackson Quinn," the aide said, his voice a melodious hum. "Ambassador Solara has requested your presence at our research base. It is an invitation, but one we strongly encourage you to accept." Quinn leaned back in his chair, squinting up at the alien. He had expected them to return, but not so soon and certainly not with an invitation that sounded more like a demand. He set his coffee down on the wooden porch table and stood slowly, stretching his arms and cracking his neck as if he hadn't a care in the world. "Tell her I'm busy," Quinn said simply, turning back to the cabin door. He had no intention of being anyone's test subject, not even for a species as advanced as the Zalari. The aide's eyes flickered with surprise, perhaps even offense, but he quickly regained his composure. "This invitation is not to be taken lightly, human. The ambassador has shown great interest in you. Your defiance intrigues her." Quinn stopped at the door, turning slightly to face the alien. His eyes were steady, and his voice carried a weight that made the Zalari pause. "I don't do well with demands, friend. If she wants to talk, she can come here." For a moment, the aide stood there, his perfect face unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and ascended the ramp, disappearing into the ship. The transport hummed, lifting off into the sky and vanishing beyond the horizon. Quinn watched it go, half expecting more trouble to follow. But instead, the desert remained quiet, the breeze rustling through the scrubby bushes, the sun climbing higher into the endless blue. He had challenged the most advanced beings in the galaxy and sent them packing for now, at least. Quinn went back inside, shook his head, and muttered to himself, "What a damn mess." It wasn't long before the Zalari returned. This time, there was no polite invitation. A few days after the first encounter, just as the sun was setting, Quinn heard the distinct hum of a Zalari ship descending above his cabin again. But instead of the aides, this time it was Solara herself. She emerged from the glowing vessel, her radiant figure silhouetted against the fading light. Quinn was outside, chopping firewood, the rhythmic thwack of his axe a stark contrast to the alien hum of her ship. He glanced up briefly, then went back to his task, his movements calm and deliberate. Solara approached, her tall, elegant frame gliding over the uneven ground with unnatural grace. She stopped a few feet from him, watching as he split a log cleanly in two with a single stroke of his axe. "You are a hard man to impress," she said, her voice soft yet resonant. Quinn set the axe down and wiped his hands on his pants, turning to face her. "Not trying to be." Solara's eyes gleamed with amusement as she took in the rugged surroundings, the worn cabin, the chopped wood, the stark simplicity of it all. "We've seen humans fight for our attention, our approval. Yet here you are, completely indifferent. I could command you to come with me, you know." Quinn raised an eyebrow. "You could try." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the challenge between them palpable. Solara's smile widened slightly, though there was no malice in it, just curiosity and interest that had only deepened since their first meeting. "You intrigue me, Jackson Quinn," Solara said, her tone thoughtful. "I want to understand what drives you. Why do you resist us?" Quinn shrugged. "I'm not resisting anything. I just don't see why I need to jump through hoops because you're curious. You come here, make a big show about how advanced you are, but you've barely scratched the surface of what it means to live. Out here," he gestured to the vast desert surrounding them. "It's about survival. No fancy tech. No beauty contests. Just you and the land." Solara's expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp. "You think we've lost something because of our advancement? Maybe. Or maybe you never had it," Quinn replied, crossing his arms. "What's all your tech worth if you've never faced a real challenge? You come to Earth, look at us like we're ants, but I've spent my whole life learning how to live without anyone's help. Can you say the same?" Solara's gaze narrowed, but not in anger. There was something deeper there, something she hadn't expected. "You believe strength comes from hardship, from the struggle to survive?" Quinn nodded. "I don't just believe it. I live it." A long pause followed, the air between them charged with an unspoken tension. Solara studied him, her amethyst eyes reflecting the fading light of the sun, and for the first time in her long existence, she felt a flicker of doubt. Not doubt in herself, but doubt in the Zolari's view of humanity. She had always seen humans as primitive, inferior beings that had not yet evolved to the point of understanding the grander workings of the universe. And yet, here stood a man who seemed to embody a strength and resilience that her people had overlooked, a man who wasn't afraid of them or their power. "You think we haven't faced challenges, that our existence has been without struggle?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost introspective. "I don't know," Quinn replied, his tone blunt. "But I know there's more to life than what you can learn from tech and knowledge. There's a different kind of wisdom out here, one that comes from getting your hands dirty." Solara nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "Perhaps we've been too quick to judge your species," she admitted. "We've always valued knowledge and beauty, but perhaps there's something in the raw simplicity of survival that we've ignored." Quinn gave a half-smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just starting to realize that for all your advanced thinking, you're missing something right in front of you." The two stood in the desert twilight, neither speaking for a long while. There was a mutual respect building between them, an understanding that neither had expected to find. Solara, the embodiment of Zolari beauty and intellect, and Quinn, the rugged man of the earth, stood at the crossroads of two very different worlds. "I will take you up on your offer," Solara said suddenly, her voice steady. "I'll learn from you. Not in a lab, not with probes or tests. I'll learn what it means to survive by your rules, here on this land." Quinn eyed her, surprised but not showing it. "You think you're up for it?" Solara's smile was genuine this time. "I think I'll surprise you, human." In the days that followed, Quinn found himself thrust into a strange partnership with the Zolari ambassador. True to her word, Solara began to live by the same code Quinn had followed all his life, surviving off the land, relying on nothing but the natural world for sustenance. She learned how to hunt, how to gather, and how to navigate the harsh landscape. And in turn, Quinn began to understand that perhaps the Zolari's arrogance wasn't born out of malice, but out of centuries of isolation from the raw forces of nature. Solara struggled at first, and used to the physicality of survival. But Quinn could see that she was determined, and he found himself almost admiring her persistence. As the days turned into weeks, something shifted between them. What had begun as a test of wills turned into an uneasy respect, and perhaps the first glimmer of something more. But neither of them could shake the feeling that this partnership was only the beginning of something far more significant than either of them could imagine. Weeks passed in the desert, and what had begun as an experiment had grown into something much deeper. The Zolari ambassador, Solara, had committed to Quinn's challenge, learning to live by the rules of the Earth, rules that had governed humanity for millennia before technology had shielded people from the harshness of nature. For a species that had mastered the stars, this was entirely new. Solara, despite her initial struggle, adapted quicker than Quinn had anticipated. She wasn't just beautiful and intelligent, she was resilient. Underneath her flawless exterior was a willpower forged in the crucible of Zolari society, where intellect and superiority ruled supreme. But here in the desert, it wasn't about control or intellect, it was about survival. And it turned out that Solara had more of that in her than Quinn had initially given her credit for. The morning air was cool as Solara crouched beside a rocky outcrop, watching as Quinn showed her how to set traps for small game. The Zolari's usual regal posture had relaxed into something more grounded. Her flowing, iridescent clothing had been replaced with simple gear that allowed for easy movement across the rough terrain. Even her pristine, shimmering hair was tied back, though it still shimmered faintly in the rising sun. Quinn, for his part, had grown to appreciate her presence. At first, he thought the entire exercise was a waste of time, just another way for the Zolari to amuse themselves with their superiority. But Solara wasn't here to mock. She was here to learn. And in those quiet moments, where words were few and actions spoke louder, Quinn had seen something shift in her. "Like this," Quinn said, demonstrating how to tie the snare's knot. His hands moved swiftly, the motions fluid from years of practice. Solara mimicked the knot, her slender fingers working with surprising dexterity. She looked up at Quinn after finishing. "Am I getting it right?" Quinn examined her work, nodding with approval. "Not bad." She smiled slightly at the compliment. It wasn't the first time she had found herself taking satisfaction in these small victories. Back on her home planet, where knowledge flowed through her mind like an endless stream, there was never a moment of doubt. Here, though, the physical struggle gave her something she hadn't known. She craved an earned sense of accomplishment. "You seem to be getting the hang of this," Quinn said, sitting back on his heels. "You sure you didn't grow up on a farm somewhere in space?" Solara chuckled, a sound that had grown less rare in the days they'd spent together. "Hardly. Our civilization was built on knowledge, art, and intellect. But we never had to fight for survival in this way. Our challenges were different." Quinn looked at her, curious. He had never asked much about the Zolari beyond their initial condescension, but he had to admit he was curious about how such a perfect species had come to be. "What kind of challenges? You've got all that tech, all that beauty. What could be so hard for your people?" Solara's smile faded slightly as she looked out over the desert, the rising sun casting long shadows over the dunes. "There was a time when we weren't so different from you," she said quietly. "We fought for survival, too. But as we advanced, as our technology grew more sophisticated, we left those struggles behind. We created a society where no one wanted for anything. Our lives became centered around perfection, perfect minds, perfect bodies, perfect societies. But in our quest for perfection, we lost something." Quinn listened, intrigued. He hadn't expected this level of introspection from her. "What did you lose?" Solara met his gaze, her violet eyes reflecting the distant horizon. "We lost the ability to truly struggle. And with that, we lost a piece of our soul. When everything is handed to you, When your life is without hardship, it becomes hollow. We didn't realize it at the time, of course. We thought we had achieved enlightenment. But as the centuries passed, some of us began to feel the emptiness. Quinn watched her, understanding more than he'd expected. He'd seen it in people before, the kind of discontent that came from having everything you wanted, and yet feeling as though something essential was missing. "That's why you're here," Quinn said, piecing it together. "It's not just about studying us, is it?" Solara nodded slowly. "No. It's about understanding something we've forgotten. You, humans, still have this raw connection to life, to the struggle. You live in a world where you must constantly adapt, constantly fight. And that gives you something we lost long ago." Quinn stood up, wiping the dirt from his hands. "Funny, most people here would trade places with you in a heartbeat. They'd love to have all your technology, all your perfection." Solara stood too, brushing sand from her knees. "They wouldn't, not if they understood what comes with it." Quinn gave her a long look. "Maybe not." The days stretched into weeks, and Quinn and Solara continued their strange partnership. She learned more from him than just survival skills. There were moments when they'd sit by the campfire at night, the crackling flames reflecting in Solara's violet eyes, and they'd talk about Earth, about the Zalari, about life. Quinn, who had always been content with his own company, found himself strangely comfortable with her presence. There was an ease between them now, an understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Solara, for her part, had come to respect Quinn in a way she hadn't thought possible. He was rough, unpolished, and entirely unlike anyone she had ever known. Yet his simple wisdom, his resilience, had opened her eyes to the limitations of her own people's supposed superiority. One night, as the stars blazed brightly overhead, Solara turned to Quinn, breaking the silence that had settled over them. "I was wrong about your species," she said quietly. Quinn glanced at her. "How so?" "When we first came here, we believed we were far above you. We saw your world as primitive, your people as incomplete. But I see now that you possess something we've overlooked. Something important." Quinn smirked. "And what's that?" "Your strength," Solara replied, her voice soft but earnest. "Not just physical strength, but the strength to endure, to adapt. You may not have our technology, but you have something we've lost. Something we need." Quinn stared into the fire, the flickering light dancing across his withered face. "We've got a lot of flaws, too," he said after a long pause. "We're not perfect. Hell, far from it. But we know how to survive. And that's worth something." Solara nodded. "It's worth everything." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The desert night stretched on, quiet and vast, as the fire crackled between them. But the silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding, of two beings from different worlds who had found common ground. As the days continued, word spread among the Zalari that something had shifted in their ambassador. Her reports to her people were no longer clinical observations about human behavior. They were filled with insights, with a depth of understanding that had been missing before. She no longer spoke of humanity as an inferior species. Instead, she spoke of them as equals beings with their own kind of wisdom, their own kind of strength. When it came time for the Zalari to make their final assessment of Earth, Solara stood before her people, her presence commanding as ever. But this time, her words carried a weight that no one had expected. "Humans are not the primitive creatures we once thought them to be," she began. "They are flawed, yes, but their flaws give them something we no longer possess, a raw, untamed resilience. They live with the struggle of survival every day, and in that struggle, they find meaning. We have much to learn from them." Her words sent ripples through the Zalari community, and when the decision was made, it was unlike any the Zalari had ever made before. They would not seek to uplift humanity in the way they had once planned. Instead, they would form a partnership, a mutual exchange of knowledge, but one rooted in respect, not superiority. As the Zalari prepared to depart Earth, Solara visited Quinn one last time. "You've changed the way I see your people," she said, standing beside him in the desert as the Zalari ships prepared to leave. Quinn shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Glad I could help." Solara smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "You've done more than that, Quinn. You've reminded us of something we'd forgotten. And for that, I thank you." Quinn watched as the Zalari ships ascended into the sky, their violet glow fading as they disappeared into the stars. For a long while, he stood in silence, the vast desert stretching out before him. He wasn't sure what the future held for humanity, but one thing was certain: things would never be the same. As he turned back toward his cabin, the night quiet around him, Quinn knew that his life in the desert would continue. But now, he carried with him the knowledge that even the most advanced beings in the universe could learn something from the simple act of surviving. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough.